Welcome back to Getting Open with me, Andrea Miller. Whew, today's show is such a doozy, guys. And you've got to listen to my guest's story, which involves a person who was a Zen Buddhist meditation teacher who ran into drug smuggling, ended up with a 30-year federal prison sentence, and ended up completely liberating himself, writing books, and transforming not only his own life, but literally millions of other lives through radical responsibility, through this incredibly empowering meditation technique. This story is mind-blowing. I hope you listen to the end, because not only is it a compelling story, there are so many practical takeaways that can legitimately transform your own life and the life of the people around you. Let's get into it. I am delighted to introduce a guest I've been wanting to talk to on the show for so long, Fleet Maull. Fleet Maull, PhD, is an author, meditation teacher, management consultant, trainer, and executive coach who facilitates deep transformation for individuals and organizations through his philosophy and program of radical responsibility and neurosomatic mindfulness. And I promise we're going to tell you what that is. He is a tireless and dedicated peacemaker and servant leader working for positive social transformation and a more just and sustainable global society. And you are just going to fall in love with him. His presence is magnetic. And wow, does Fleet ever have a compelling story to share with you today? I know you will find it extremely inspiring. Fleet, welcome. So nice to talk to you.
Thank you for having me, Andrea.
Yeah. So can we start with your compelling story of going to prison and how that changed everything for you?
Yeah. Sometimes people think I discovered meditation and so forth on my spiritual journey while in prison, which happens for some prisoners. Fortunately, not nearly enough, but it does happen. But actually, I'd been involved in what I'm involved in now for a long time before I went to prison. I got really became kind of connected with initially with Zen teachings when I was in high school. Actually, I discovered Zen Buddhism, LSD, and marijuana all the same the summer of my sophomore year in high school. And it kind of began from there. I grew up in Missouri with fairly conservative areas, so it was not a lot going on. I didn't have a lot of compatriots who were interested in the same things, but a few. And this was that was 66, and then in 1968, when I graduated, incredibly tumultuous year in U.S. history with the assassinations and Kent State killings and more. And so, and by that time, I was kind of a classic angry young man. So I graduated from high school with a big raging hole in my gut and a lot of anger and alienation. And I just went headlong into the counterculture of the time. I went off to a big state university, but really just went headlong into the counterculture and the anti-war politics and all the rest of it, and the drug, sex, and rock and roll, and the whole thing. And but I was always at heart a spiritual seeker, and that had always been a through line in my life. And so that kind of wound its way around, like a dual major of sorts. Eventually, I decided to leave the country because I was just so alienated and just wanted out. And I was also wanting to get away from the drug culture, which had gotten pretty dark by then, moved from the kind of psychedelic era.
Yeah, like kind of enlightenment, right, to escape.
Yeah. And so I had some notion about going to Peru. I don't even know where I got that, but because I was always looking to reconnect with something authentic. Even my entry into the counterculture, my experimentation with drugs and so forth, was really all about reconnecting with something authentic, because my childhood had been, it felt to me anyway, my memory of it was very magical and vivid. I felt very plugged into reality. And then sometime around 5 or 6 or 7, it just went to gray tones. All the magic disappeared. And maybe that's a normal developmental process. I don't know, but I never made peace with it. And it could have had to do with the alcoholism in my family at the time, just starting school, different things. But at any rate, that's where I found myself. And so, um, uh, that just took me down a lot of twisted roads. But anyway, I did start traveling, and I ended up living on a sailboat for a year, which was very cleansing, and in off the coast of Central America, and eventually made my way to Peru. And I did really connect with something very authentically magical there. Apart from any drug usage or anything, it was just environmentally there. You'd wake up in the morning. I was living out in the Sacred Valley of the Incas in Peru, and you just wake up in the morning, and the place was just alive, right? It just had this very magical quality to it. And but the first time I went back to the States for a visit, I wasn't able to bring that with me. I realized it was environmental. I hadn't internalized it. And, so I was still on that search.
And are we talking your early 20s at that point?
I'm in my early 20s, and this is in the early to mid 1970s. And so I ended up living as an expat down there, and eventually ran out of money, and got involved in small scale drug smuggling and so forth to sustain my lifestyle down there, and justified that with all this us versus them thinking. I had this whole notion the whole world was, hypocritical, and I had all these justifications.
And Fleet, you're not wrong about that.
Well, yes and no, but
Yeah.
I could have come up with a more creative response to all that.
Yeah.
But at any rate, in 1974, I found out about the founding of then Naropa Institute, now Naropa University, by the Tibetan meditation master Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And I just knew I had to go there. I'd already been, I've been trying to practice meditation on my own for quite a long time. I had kind of zeroed in on the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. There were very few books available at that time, but somehow I gravitated towards those. I had them with me in this very remote valley I was living in off the Sacred Valley of Peru. And some travelers found their way up to my place, as they sometimes did. And they had a copy of Rolling Stone magazine from 1974, which had a big feature story about the first summer sessions at Naropa Institute, which was a huge spiritual happening with a lot of the major avant-garde figures of the time, William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg and all kind of Kerouac. I'm not Kerouac, but I mean Jeffrey Corso and Buckminster
And
Fuller
were
was
they,
there.
And I think some of those names, I also think the progenitors of the LSD movement. So was there LSD involved and other forms of psychedelics?
I'm sure it was in the background, but I don't think that was the primary emphasis. It was really a kind of spiritual happening. It was focused. The two main teachers were Trungpa Rinpoche, and then Ram Dass was there teaching as well.
Wow!
So Ram Dass
Snap.
coming from the Vedic, his tradition, and kind of pretty love and lighty. Trungpa Rinpoche coming from a pretty hardcore Buddhist perspective. But it was a huge. They expected a couple hundred people. They got 1,500 people for each of 2 summer sessions, and many of the prominent meditation teachers today were there. People like Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, Joseph Goldstein were all there.
Oh, no way. I didn't realize that. That's so cool. I mean, to have that, just to kind of have that as, rooting for them and energetically, that's really cool. By the way, is Naropa is it in Colorado?
It's in Boulder, Colorado. Yeah,
that's what I thought.
Colorado.
Okay, cool.
So, I zeroed in on Trungpa Rinpoche in particular and just knew I had to go up there. And I knew I needed more. I was only getting so far trying to practice meditation on my own out of books. I knew I needed more teaching, a support of a community, and so forth. So I decided, I went up there to check it out and decided to roll in the Masters in Buddhist and Western Psychology program, which is now called Contemplative Psychotherapy, and my main interest there was the practice. I hadn't really decided. I had a major in psychology as an undergrad, but I wasn't really necessarily interested in pursuing a career as a psychologist or psychotherapist, but that was the program that had the most emphasis on practice. So I signed up, and it was a very intensive 3-year clinical training program, and it really, really transformed my life in many ways. It was very deep, and a lot of the skills I learned there still really support the work I do today. But I was still caught up in this shadow lifestyle, and I eventually became a close student of Trungpa Rinpoche, and I traveled with him a lot. I was one of his primary attendants, but I kept this secret life and I disappear once or twice a year and do a smuggling rung, and that's the way I continue to kind of live outside the system. And I put myself through graduate school doing that. My marriage was falling apart. I kept my marriage problems at bay with the money, and I wasn't really trying to get rich. I would just do it till I ran out of money, then I go do it again, right? And I knew it had to stop. There was a huge cognitive dissonance, but I would self-medicate around that. At that time, I was spending probably half the year in retreats and intensive programs, very sincerely involved, but the other half of the year running around like this crazy cocaine cowboy doing the smuggling thing, right?
And
And
by the way,
so,
were you just curious? Were you using at the time, or was it just
I was definitely using,
financial?
yeah, I was
Okay.
definitely using, but I was using when it was there and when I was involved in the smuggling, and but when I was off in retreats, I wasn't using, right? So I had this kind of split life, this kind of completely schizoid life,
You had real
and I knew it.
separation.
Yeah, I knew it had to end, but before I was able to unravel all that, I was indicted and ended up going to prison for 14 and a half years. So, but when I arrived there, I already had a practice. I'd been trained for 10 years, not only as a practitioner, but as a teacher. So I was deeply grounded in practice. I had all this clinical training. And it was a huge wake up call when I finally did get indicted and went to prison, especially when I got sentenced.
And where were you in prison?
It was a federal prison in Southwest Missouri. It's the maximum security federal prison hospital is where I did my time. Just they have regular prisoners there to help run the place and have jobs, and so it was just the one closer to where my case was. I was indicted in St. Louis, so this was the closest prison. And
Did you have
um,
kids at the time?
yes, I did have a son at the time. Yes, and that's what really woke me up when I got locked up. That's what I had to face. That I've been putting my son's life at risk for a long time and making a lot of selfish decisions with all kinds of internal justifications. And I had to face all that. And I became radically dedicated to just getting all the negativity out of my life and doing something positive. And originally, I was sentenced to 30 years no parole, so I thought my life was pretty much over. Yeah,
Wow,
and
Fleet.
yeah, and I actually the day of my sentence, I was facing a potential life sentence, and I was hoping maybe I'd get 10 to 15, but I got 30. And it wasn't until I'd been in prison for a while that I figured out that fortunately I was sentenced under the old law prior to 1987 when there was still what they called good time. So if you stayed out of trouble, you had up front statutory good time. On a long sentence like mine, you had 10 days a month. And then if you kept a job, you didn't have to do a good job, but if you just kept a job while you're in prison, you earned another 5 days as you went. So I figured out I was in prison for a while before I figured all this out, but I eventually figured out I'd serve 18 and a half years if I stayed out of trouble. Then on appeal, they knocked off one count from my aggregate sentence and should have gotten me a new trial, but it didn't. But at any rate, they reduced my aggregate sentence from 30 to 25. And then I knew I'd serve 14 and a half, which is what I served. But it was primarily, the impact it had on my son and what I'd done to him that just really, really woke me up finally. And I became radically dedicated to leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or even died in prison because I had no surety that I would survive my time. There was a lot of violence there, and it was a federal prison hospital. Men were dying of every kind of illness you can imagine. But this was right at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, so there was a lot
I
of
was
AIDS.
thinking AIDS. Yeah, I was thinking
That's a
that would
lot
be
of AIDS
really
and
scary.
liver disease and heart disease, all kinds of ailments. People were dying there, and plus people were dying of violence. And so, I had no surety I would survive my time. And also, once I got in that environment, it really woke me up to, um, you know, yeah, the jig was really up in terms of my life. Whatever kind of life I was going to be able to create for myself, or any hope of having a life beyond prison, was going to be 200% up to me. And I realized I had to take 200% ownership for having got myself into that situation, what I was going to do with it, and any future I'd be able to create for myself. So, that's really where the radical responsibility philosophy that I developed emerged from. And it stood me well. I also realized that I was in an incredibly negative environment and that if I wasn't really proactive about doing so, I could end up like a lot of prisoners end up, angry, bitter, with a big victim story, and there's a lot of racism in prison. I mean, it's just a really negative environment, and I didn't want to come out of prison that way, but I didn't even want to be that way in there. Fortunately, I had enough background and good values from my family. It's not what I wanted to be, but that was my world. That was my community. I still had to be part of that community. And so that was kind of a dance all those years of being part of that community, but not being immersed in that mindset. Mm-hmm.
Let me just interrupt for a moment. How long were you in prison before you realized that you had to take 200% responsibility? And honestly, my whole body is filled with chills right now, listening to you tell that story and listening to this,
It was really right
youngish
away.
man.
Yeah,
It was,
no,
you got it. You were like,
oh, it was
okay.
immediately apparent. It was immediately apparent to me. Yeah, yeah, it was immediately apparent to me. Uh, and um, and then this idea of having to really, uh, you know, guard and cultivate a positive mindset rather than buying into the kind of culture, the convict culture that in prison, there's a really intense polarized culture in prison among the staff and among the prisoners, and they demonize each other, and it's kind of a reinforcing, re-traumatizing cycle between those two populations constantly. It just creates this very harmful, dehumanizing environment. On a good day, you might have only a half dozen interactions with the staff or with your fellow prisoners that are incredibly demeaning, really assault on your own sense of humanity. That's on a good day, right? So you had to really, um, have the wherewithal. You're either going to buy into that, or you have to have the wherewithal to have the resilience to be with that and not get in a totally reactive state around it.
And at that point, was your son visiting you regularly? I mean,
No,
what
my
was
son
that
went
like?
back. His mom was from Peru, and they were in the States when this happened. But they went back to Peru, and it was the uh, I felt they would be a lot safer back there. And but my family continued to support them and my son to a degree down there, and they would bring my son up every other year, and he'd be up in the States for a month or two, and they'd bring him down to see me on weekends and so forth. So I'd see him like every other year, and I corresponded with him as best I could. But young kids are not great at correspondence, and teenagers even worse, right? So but I did my best to stay in touch with them. But that was really the most. I mean, prison is not a fun place to be by any stretch of the imagination. Quite the opposite. But really, the most painful part of being in prison for me, and I think for a lot of people who are incarcerated, was being separated from my son and my family.
What did you say to him? I mean, is there a moment where you just felt like you were able to say something that could give him comfort, or take responsibility?
Well, at that age, I couldn't really have conversations about that. He knew what was happening. He visited me in jail before he left, and I stayed in touch. I just really tried to support him and be positively encouraging to him. It wasn't until I got out and we started working through our stuff. By that time he was in his early 20s, and we could and we had it was quite a pathway of working through our stuff together.
Has he forgiven you?
Oh yeah, he did.
And more
Uh,
importantly, have you forgiven you?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've done all kinds of work around this, and he's. I lost my son 4 years ago, so he's no longer with
Oh, I
us.
didn't know
Yeah,
that. Oh my
yeah,
gosh, I'm so sorry.
yeah. He died the first year of the pandemic. I don't think it was COVID related, but he had suffered an injury. He was actually assaulted in Cusco, Peru. He was back and forth his whole life um, in Peru in the States. And he was down there and he was in a club late at night. And I think he just stepped into the wrong situation and he got assaulted. And so he had a very severe head injury. That was quite a long journey, his recovery. He did recover, but then about 4 or 5 years later, he started to have seizures. And so he was suffering with epilepsy as a result of scar tissue in his frontal lobes from the injury. And so that was a whole journey because he didn't like being on the medication and so forth. And he eventually moved back to Peru because he felt it would be less stressful. He was a chef and he was working in high end restaurants as a chef or a general manager, and very, very stressful work. And it would trigger seizures. And so he had moved back to Peru thinking it would be less stressful down there. And he wanted to try to start a restaurant down there, and he wasn't down there 6 months before the pandemic hit, I don't think. And then so he was stuck there, and um, his mom just found him one morning. He was already gone. So
Oh my God, I
he
am so
probably had a
sorry.
seizure in the middle of the night and probably triggered a cardiac event. Yeah. So, but along the way, we had quite a journey together. And since I got out of prison in 1999, so that was about 21 years. And so, we worked through a lot of father-son stuff as fathers and sons do. But there was
for all the dads and maybe sons too. What's your advice? I mean, listen, your experience is extreme in being incarcerated, but and I'm a mom of two boys. All parents screw up. What's your advice for making repairs and building those deep bonds when you've screwed up as a parent? And I also come from a family of alcoholics, right? So when I think about some of those, just some of those, I mean, I don't drink, but I mean, just certain tendencies can be repeated, even though when you're trying super hard, not, like behaviorally, emotionally. So what's your advice for dads and sons?
Well, I don't think it's any simple advice I can give, but it's just, you got to be committed, and be willing to be genuine and vulnerable. And, I was in a duel. My son was struggling. Fortunately, he stayed away from, he never got in trouble with the law. But, he was a hard worker. He'd get it going and things would be going well. He'd be working hard and he'd be completely independent for, a couple of years, then things would fall apart and he'd need me to bail him out. And that happened repeatedly. He didn't like coming to me to get bailed out. And I was always, am I helping him? Should I, do it? It's tough love. Well, how should I do this? And so it was always a lot of tension around that. But over the years, I mean, I sat and listened to him a lot, and I had facilitated sessions where he screamed at me about stuff. And, I just was there available for whatever healing he needed. And at the same time was trying to be supportive to him, provide some guidance and provide some healthy boundaries. So there was a mix between really being open to whatever he needed from me to heal and for our relationship to heal. And at the same time, trying to provide him with some kind of, healthy boundaries and some kind of guidance. So that was always a mixed bag and a little difficult to navigate.
Yeah. And it's maybe a good sort of segue back to radical responsibility, because when I think about, there's this propensity for going no contact now where, and not just children, adult children to their parents, but, siblings and so forth. I mean, the idea that you could hold the space for him to be furious with you, a lot of people can't. And I'm guessing he probably said things that were hurtful and true, right? And what a gift to be able to hold that space and hear it and reflect it back. So, just saying for all the parents and, myself included, holding that space for our kids when they're upset with us, I think is one of the greatest gifts we can give them. And then back to us, because we all have blind spots and we've all screwed up, right? So just saying, great job on that, Papa. But let's really rewind to radical responsibility. And did you develop that while you were in prison? And what does it mean? And how can people apply it?
That really came out of this realization that it was only through that kind of radical ownership, radical accountability that I was going to be able to do anything with my life, right? And, it stood me very well because, almost everybody in prisons in that culture has a big victim story going on. One kind of, society may perceive them as the perpetrators, but they feel victimized by the system. And really the majority have childhood histories of victimization. That's how they end up in trouble in the first place.
Yeah, neglect and abuse and all sorts of challenges growing up, right?
Yeah. Really severe. I mean, we did a lot of intensive trainings and workshops that I created in the prison and brought outside people in to do. And we'd get people in these kind of spaces and you'd find out that 80-90% experience severe emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, or all three as children. So a lot of people are kind of set up to end up in trouble. But still, once we're adults, the only person that can get us going in a different direction is us. And so, it was clear to me that that's what I needed to focus on. And, it's not a new idea. I mean, the idea of personal responsibility is given some lip service in our society, but there's a lot of victim thinking going on as well. And even in that culture, even the staff all feel victimized, and they feel victimized by the prisoner population. They feel victimized by management. They feel victimized by, everybody's got a big victim story. And there's a lot of shame and blame in our culture, and there's a lot of reification of victim mindsets and victim stories. And it's not that people aren't victimized, but when you end up in that mindset where you're continually blaming everyone but yourself for what's going on for you, in your life. At some point, and that's not to say that people haven't contributed to the obstacles we encounter or our childhoods haven't been impactful, but at some point we're making decisions, and that's really what's creating our future destiny. And, these ideas have been around for a long, long time, but I think I put it together in a way that the reason I call it radical responsibility is because generally when people ask me, what does that mean? I say it's voluntarily embracing 100% ownership for each and every circumstance we face in life. Everyone.
Hang on, so rewind that. Just say it one more time. It is
voluntarily embracing 100% ownership or responsibility for each and every circumstance we face in life.
That's radical responsibility, which, I've studied your work, and what I understand, it's like, even if it's not your fault, something goes wrong, you jump in and say, well, how do I make it better? Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. It's like at some point, we do want to look at our relationship to the circumstance in life because in many cases, we have had a lot to do with creating them or allowing them. And it's important not to blame ourselves. We want to look at that so we can learn, because if we can learn how we got from one point to another that we're not happy about, we can make different choices in the future. So it has nothing to do with self-blame. It's really important to understand that radical responsibility has absolutely nothing to do with blame. It's not about blaming others, obviously, but it's not about blaming ourselves, not at all. It's not about blaming victims. It's about choice and recognizing that's the only place we have any real power. And so at some point, even if everyone would agree we have a circumstance that had nothing to do with our own choices or behaviors, and it just fell out of the sky and landed on our head, and it was completely unjust, that all may be true. But at some point, the most saddening question is, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to let it take me down? Am I going to develop a victim mindset around it? Or am I going to find the most creative way I can to move forward? And that might include seeking justice. It might include seeking all kinds of support, but doing it from a different mindset, not from the victim mindset. So it's a place where we have any real power. Otherwise, it's completely human to kvetch and feel victimized. And in some cases, maybe we have been victimized, and we may need that validated as part of our healing. And it's completely human, to have all those feelings, and even in less extreme circumstances, to kvetch and complain. But at some point, we can recognize that is not really moving the needle for us. We're not moving our lives forward with that. In fact, with the given amount of energy we have, where do we want to put most of that energy? I want to put it mostly in the choices I'm making, which is what's really going to determine my future.
Yeah, what the words that come to mind for me is it's radically rational, right? To be in that blame and victim mentality is irrational. And while it's natural and common and incredibly pervasive, like you said, it's a superpower to be able to really take that ownership and say, who cares how much I contributed or didn't? What can I do now? Like, to me, what you're offering people here with radical responsibility is actually freedom, right? You said it's like you have the power in that moment to make a choice, and you can choose victimhood, and you can choose blame, or you can choose.
Yeah, you could also
freedom.
call it radical self-empowerment. And
I love that. Yes,
I wouldn't say it's irrational because in many cases it may be completely rational to have feelings of having been victimized, because one may have been victimized, or even in a regular situation, there may be we may have contributed something, but others may have contributed something. But I would say it's an inefficient use of our energy to get caught up in blaming and all that, blaming ourselves, blaming others. Whether we're blaming ourselves or blaming others, it's actually debilitating, and it erodes our power. So I would say it's really about the most efficient use of our time is to focus on our own choices and learning as much as we can, and then focusing on our own choices. What can I do? What's the most creative way I can respond to this situation that'll move my own life forward? And really, in terms of my own enlightened self-interest, my long-term interest, that usually ends up being in everyone else's interest as well, because we're all interconnected. So when we think long-term, it usually ends up being in everybody's interest.
So is there a phrase or something that we can put on the screen and put in the show notes and have everybody say to themselves who are listening or watching, what is that one line? Okay, something went wrong, something went bad, the milk got spilled, the car got damaged, this thing happened. What should our audience listening and watching, what should they say to themselves to?
Well, we call this the magical radical responsibility question. It's very simple. What can I do?
What can I do?
What can I do? Because the minute, not what can I do like in a resigned way, but what can I do? because the minute I ask myself that question, I'm out of the victim mindset. I'm into what we call the co-creative mindset, because there's always a million ways we can approach any situation. So we're thinking creatively, we're thinking about solutions.
It's what can I do, and with the right attitude, the right energy, right? And that, to me, that's a game changer. Like you said, radical self-empowerment, and that, when I think about going for shifting, making that conscious decision to shift from victimhood and blame. And you're right that there are all sorts of contributing factors. And, many of us have been, under very difficult circumstances, whether alcoholism or abuse, you name it, to take that moment and be able to shift and say, okay, that's all in the past. What can I do? To me, it is such a gift to give ourselves. And then to me, we're social creatures. When I think about that shift in energy and that shift in mindset, how contagious that is to the people around us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it also needs to be grounded in tremendous self-empathy and self-compassion, because otherwise it could trigger us into any tendencies we have towards self-blame or self-shaming. So when we're approaching radical responsibility, we also need to be building a foundation of self-empathy and self-compassion. And again, this is all about us. This is not about running around and telling others they need to be radically responsible or telling them they need to get off their victim mindset. That's their journey. It's really for us. It's about our own choices and choosing to stand in the most powerful place we can is with living a choice. But we need to do that with self-empathy and compassion and really develop a befriending relationship to ourselves. And there's often we have a lot of healing work to do to undo a lot of the blame and shaming that we've internalized from society, right? And so, because otherwise we could try to practice radical responsibility, and it would just kind of get co-opted into self-blaming if we haven't done our work to heal those tendencies. And we really need to do both the work around cultivating self-compassion and embracing radical responsibility.
Well, I want to, because you've got your neurosomatic mindfulness techniques. So I've got a bunch of questions on that. But let me ask you a question just before then about radical responsibility. You've been doing this for a long time. Do you ever struggle with it? Are there times when you're like, oh, crap, why did this happen to me? Or have you mastered this?
No, all the time. There's still, I wouldn't say all the time. It takes, my life is radically different in terms of that, But, there's always challenges. There's always, anytime the world is kind of not cooperating with us, there's a tendency to be not so happy about it.
So you're having to continue to live the practice, which is refreshing.
It's not a one-time thing. It's a choice we make every moment, every day, and every time we do it, we strengthen our capacity for doing so. Right? We're actually changing our neural architecture. We're changing our mindset. Every time we recognize we're all going to get pushed. We have this. We used to use this distinction. Above the line, below the line, but now we talk about the drama zone and the empowerment zone, right? And so when we embrace choice, we learn how to live in the empowerment zone. And when
I love that. Well, hang on. When we embrace choice, we learn to live in the empowerment zone. Okay,
right. And when we're caught in blame and shame and resentment, all the rest of it, we're in the drama zone. And so we're all going to find ourselves there. And the thing is to recognize it and shift. And we just constantly do that. So it's a practice. We have the intention and the mindset to embrace, and it gets easier and easier, and there's fewer things that push us down into the drama zone. But when something does, we just recognize it and shift.
It's just a practice. No, it's helpful because, and I presume it gets easier, but it still is a practice, even for somebody like you who has been doing it for so long. So let's shift into neurosomatic mindfulness. What is that?
It's a deeply embodied, neuroscience-informed approach to classic mindfulness and awareness meditation. It's also trauma-informed. And I've been practicing meditation for over 50 years and deeply trained in both the Tibetan and Zen traditions. But I've always been a student of the art of meditation, and I've studied just about every form of meditation out there and studied with a lot of different teachers and explored all the different traditions you could imagine. And so I've been integrating all along. I'm on the one hand, I'm very much a traditionalist. I still do very traditional Zen practice and Vajrayana practice in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But I've also been integrating all along, and neurosomatic mindfulness is a secular practice, and it's an integration of what I've been studying for 50 years. And as well, I've been really deeply studying neuroscience for the last 20, 30 years. And so I've been integrating all that. So it's an integration of really the deep yogic science and understanding from the East across traditions, Buddhism, the Vedic traditions, Hinduism, Taoism, all those traditions, as well as contemplative spirituality in the Western traditions, integrating that with what's called network neuroscience and really understanding how we can very intentionally target certain networks in the brain that support healing and personal evolution and ultimately liberation and awakening. And so
would the default mode network be the main one that
the default mode network is one of them, but actually what we're targeting is the task positive network, which regulates the default mode network.
Okay,
right?
And what is a task positive network again?
The task positive network, sometimes called the executive network, is activated when we focus our attention, direct our attention, and it has a mutually inhibitory or antagonistic relationship with the default mode network. So to the extent you bring,
and by the way, let me just ask you to
positive
rewind because I want to make sure everybody listening is following. What is the default mode network, and
the
what is the rule?
Is active when we don't direct our attention, and it's responsible for the very busy kind of discursive mind, the chatterbox between our ears. It loves to time travel into the past and worry and ruminate about the past. Loves to time travel into the future, fantasize and worry about the future. Keeps a running commentary and going about the imagined present. It's all of our sort of constant self-sensing. What about me? What do others think about me?
So a lot of judgment, negativity, typically.
It tends to be pervaded by negativity, and it's really a source of all our self-created stress. The reason it tends to be pervaded by negativity is what psychologists call negativity bias. That in evolutionary terms, our brain evolved to give more attention and valence to threat than anything else, because job one for any species is survival. So any experience of discomfort or threat goes right into long-term memory, whereas positive experience or neutral experiences don't go into long-term memory unless we focus on them for, the science says, 12 to 20 seconds. So that's why my friend Rick Hansen talks about savoring the good, because otherwise our long-term memory is mostly full of memories of threat and negativity. And so with this develops what's called an implicit memory that's negative, and then we spin everything through that implicit. So we always assume the worst, right? So this explains, just the nature of communication and media in our culture. It explains why the news only puts negative things primarily on the news. There's so much negativity in a culture, and the culture appears so negative is because of the negativity bias. So to counteract that, we need to also focus on the positive. But so actually the default mode network can be a source of tremendous creativity. In fact, it's a primary source of creativity for a lot of artists, for science, problem solvers in science, even in psychoanalysis, the technique of free association employs that. But we first have to have a sense of safety and have that default mode network not be pervaded by fear and anxiety. When we can do that, it's a tremendous source of creativity. But for most of us, it's just a very noisy part of our brain and constantly reinforces the limited self, small self ego. And it's really a source of all our self-created stress and suffering.
So hang on, real quick question about default mode network and, the creativity. Do psychedelics inhibit the default mode network, or do they make it a safer place to be?
It's theorized that one of the healing mechanisms in plant medicine and psychedelics is that it inhibits the activity of the default mode network and thus allows the brain to reorganize and have different kinds of experiences. Yes. And there's a lot of different things. Meditation can do it. In general, meditation does this. Mindfulness does it. But we can do it much more effectively with this deeply embodied approach, because we can focus our attention on anything and activate the task positive network. Probably most of your listeners have tried to thread a needle at one time or another, or bait a hook, or do something that required a lot of focus in the short term. And they probably remember that at that moment, their mind gets very quiet, at least for a moment. You may not be able to sustain that, but that's that shift. That's that shift from the default mode network to the task positive network. And we all know how when our mind's really busy and distracted, it's hard to accomplish things. And when we can really focus, our mind gets quiet. That's that shift. We're all very familiar with it.
And experientially, I mean, just the sensation of harmony and peace and relaxation, in my experience, is more associated with the latter versus, just not only are you having a hard time concentrating, you're not having much fun doing it.
Yeah, and you can learn to relax into the bulbal network and have experiences there as well. But for the most part, in terms of meditation, most people struggle with trying to learn to meditate because their minds are so busy and they find it hard and difficult and boring. And most people that start a practice quit because they just find it too difficult and too boring and it's too hard to produce results.
I mean, I just have to chime in and say, oh my gosh, I'm a big meditator, and I'm happy to share more, but I used to be in that category. And so many people I know, I can't meditate, right? They're convinced they can't meditate. What is the solution? Because the truth is, on the other side, in my experience, and it seems like yours and many others, on the other side of I can't meditate is a profoundly different lived experience.
Mm-hmm. So by practicing in this deeply embodied way, which means we're not only developing greater awareness of the sensate field on the surface of the skin, which we experience through exteroception and a particular set of neural networks that's very sensitive, highly myelinated, and thus very sensitive. And so that's a sense of touch on the skin. But we can also be aware of the internal landscape of sensate experience, touch, physical touch inside the body, right? We wouldn't normally call it touch, but it's tactile physical sensation inside the body, which we experience through a different set of neural networks that's less myelinated, less sensitive. But so those sensations are subtler unless there's some kind of extreme pain going on. But nonetheless, it's all very experiential. And it's a vast internal somatic landscape that we can develop much greater awareness of. And we access through that what's called introception, which just means internal perception. And many of us have very little interoception at all. I mean, we all have some because now we know when we're hungry, when we're tired, when we're thirsty, when we need to use the restroom, or when we're experiencing some kind of pain like a headache or indigestion. That's all interoception. Some children are born with very poor interoception, which is why there's been a lot of research done around interoception. And for those children, like going to the bathroom is always an emergency because they don't feel it. They don't have that access. But even for most of us adults, unless there's some kind of discomfort going on, we ignore the internal landscape of the body. And we're very much up in our heads because we're very visually and auditorily oriented. We have these very busy minds. So we live very disembodied lives. And especially in modern culture, we become more and more disembodied. So for people to regain access.
Would you add, just to sorry to interrupt, but would you add, I mean, when I think about how we constantly have, our technology is constantly sending more and more messages to us.
Yeah, all the distraction, all the distraction.
It feels like we're, not only are we in our heads. We're
also not tuned into the natural world because we're able to live, with our houses and our cars, and we're able to separate ourselves from the extremes of the natural world. Our forebears that live out in the natural world, they had to be tuned in. They couldn't be lost in their head. You're not going to survive, right? We have the luxury of being lost in our head a lot of the time. Unless we're walking across a busy street, we might get run over if we're not careful. But we have the luxury of being lost in our heads a lot of the time. So we lead very disembodied lives. So we have to retrain ourselves to gain access to interoceptive awareness at a deep level. But when we do that, when we focus that way, it creates a continual activation of the task positive network. And instead of struggling with thoughts, the mind quiets down naturally. Actually, in meditation, if you try to struggle with thoughts or stop thoughts, you can't do it anyway, and it's counterproductive. It just creates more thought, right? But by really deepening our deeply felt sense of embodiment physically, and especially in a more non-dual way, that provides a continual activation of the task positive network. The default network goes offline naturally, and our mind quiets down, which gives us activation.
Sorry to interrupt, but with the task positive network, is that correlated to the parasympathetic nervous system? Because when I think about just how dysregulated so many people are, how much anxiety there is, right? Which is, to me, in your head, not in your body.
It's all interconnected, but we can have the task positive network engaged with parasympathetic activation or not. We can have the task positive. We could be in a high sympathetic sympathetic branch arousal, and still have the task positive network engaged. So but in meditation, you are working with both. In meditation is, the more relaxation that you're able to have in the practice, you're going to have more parasympathetic arousal, and that combined with the activation of the task positive network is going to facilitate the deepening of your practice. And along the way, we're developing an internal neurobiofeedback loop such that any practice begins with some kind of intentional, uh, effortful self-regulation. We focus on where the mind wanders, we bring it back. The mind wanders, we bring it back. We're doing it intentionally with some kind of effort. But over time, it can become effortless because our nervous system is learning how to access it and it starts to recognize the state of attention stabilization, and it knows how to get there. Then that further is a portal to deeper states of awareness, and then eventually deep states of flow where all of our internal systems are going into coherence. And we're experiencing what in the West has been called flow and what in the East is called different levels of samadhi. And so the nervous system is learning how to get there. We've developed much greater access, which means our whole neural architecture is changing, and we're able to practice in a very relaxed way, which is critical to going into the deeper states of healing and awareness. You can't force your way into those states. You have to relax your way into those states. So the more our practice can become effortless. So that's why this neuroscientifically informed approach that is deeply embodied it really optimizes that. And people don't have to go sit in a cave for 30 years to do this. You can start deepening your practice right off the bat. And beginners can have much more likely to stay with the practice because they're going to have a positive experience right off the bat because they receive this kind of instruction.
And they don't necessarily have that mindset of, I can't do it. Okay, but for whether you're a beginner and you've never meditated before and you say, I want what this guy's having, or you've tried it and you rail against it, for all those different people, what do you recommend? How do they get started?
Well, even, we have really advanced practitioners coming into our programs who've been practicing for 20, 30 years, done a lot of extensive retreat practice, and they're experiencing profound transformation of their practice. Because most people have not been introduced to embodiment at this level. There's always, the standard mindfulness awareness practice is mindfulness of breath and body. But we have, when we direct our attention to the breath or to the body or both, we're really directing it to the concept of body, to the concept of breath. And the way our brain works is constantly economizing because we're exposed to trillions of bits of data all the time. So the brain's job is really to filter out everything but what we absolutely need to see to survive or function in the moment. That's how our brain works, right?
But Fleet, just to rewind, since we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes, for the person who's like, okay, whether I've had a rich practice and I want to go even deeper, or I can't meditate, right? They keep telling themselves that. What do they do?
They come to one of our courses in neurosomatic mindfulness, and we'll teach them how to do this.
Okay. And what kind of level of commitment are we talking? Can they do 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes, 20? Does it have to be an hour? Like for somebody who's I'm really willing to do this.
Yeah, there's really no set standard about any of that. Practicing just a little bit will be helpful. Moving in the direction of this neurosomatic mindfulness approach will be extremely helpful. So whether you're practicing 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week, or you're practicing an hour a day every day, or anywhere in between, it's all going to be helpful. And one has to kind of learn how to do this, but it's not hard to learn, but you really need the guidance to learn this, right?
Well, and that's what I was going to ask. Are they guided meditations and we'll put
you learn it through guided meditation, but then you learn to do it on, the guidance is there to help enrich your own practice, and then you're being trained to do it on your own. But the guided meditation is very helpful to begin with. And we offer all kinds of entryways in this. I do all kinds of free programs throughout the year, every month.
Free, everybody. Free.
Then we have, and then we have more in-depth programs. We have retreats, and we probably had at this point we've had about 25,000 people train in neurosomatic mindfulness at various levels, right? And so there's a lot of access points, and people can go to our HeartMind website, heartmind.co, and start learning about it. There's free resources right on there. And
heartmind.co if you want to go in and get a taste for what can be absolutely transformative in your life for free from Fleet Maull. We'll put the link in the show notes as well. But I just want to make sure people listening are like heartmind.co, not .com.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead with what you were trying to conclude.
Well, we have all kinds of free offerings that are available, and at the same time, then we have courses and we have intensives. We're just kicking off another 60-day intensive that's a Waking Up Now program that's incredibly transformative for people. So it's at every level of commitment or investment that people want to make in their practice, it's available. But, even just a little bit of instruction can be helpful to find your way into embodied practice. But it's also important that the instruction be trauma informed because and delivered in a trauma informed manner, because we hold trauma in our body. So when someone starts dropping into the body at a deeper level, they may find that triggering, and they may run into difficulties. So there really needs to be experienced, well-informed guidance to help people reclaim their bodies.
Yeah, and when you talk about reclaiming your body, it's like you're reclaiming your whole being. That's been my experience.
It's really about coming home. It's really about coming home. And
yes.
we need a home as
Into a
human beings.
safe
We need a home.
home and a
It's a safe
joyful
home, and
home and a
we need a
peaceful
home,
home.
because if we don't have a home, we're going to go looking for one, and usually we go looking for one in all the wrong places. Like the
Amen.
old country song
All
used
the
to say.
addictions, all the distractions that so many of us have grappled with. For me, workaholism, right? It's like, okay, I'm not going to drink too much, but I can work too much, and that, it's, in some ways just as bad, because you think it's okay and it's not okay. Let me just circle back, just one last question or two before we conclude. I love how radical responsibility, when I think about really being able to do that, to have a deep embodiment practice, a deep meditation practice, to me, those two go hand in hand, because I think
Absolutely.
it's a lot easier to be radically responsive, like you said, to be able to have that self-compassion and self-empathy.
The current neuroscience says a very direct correlation between increased interoceptive awareness and emotional intelligence, emotion regulation, and emotional wisdom. So we're going to, before we get caught up or really triggered into cycles of victim mindset and blaming and shaming, we're going to pick up on it long before it gets that extreme. And we're going to be able to make subtle shifts. So instead, it's like when we first learned to ride a bike, we may be all over the place, right? But eventually it's like we're just making subtle little corrections. We're never in perfect balance. We're just constantly making subtle corrections. So the more emotionally tuned in we are, the more embodied we are. We're just making subtle corrections to stay in that most optimal mindset.
Yeah, place a balance on your bike. So I think my last or one or two burning questions, just back to the victimhood thing. I was having this discussion with some of my staff, and we all know people who insist on victimhood. They insist it's not their fault. They insist somebody else is to blame. They insist, all these bad things happen to them, and the defensiveness is there. And even if you're trying so hard to get through to that person, what do you do, Fleet, when you've got somebody you really care about, whether it's a sibling, a coworker, a spouse, any relationship you feel you really love that person, and you can see how they are insisting on victimhood. What can we do?
Well, there may not be much we can do at all other than love the person and be there for them. I think people need empathy.
I was afraid you would say that.
If we go in and try to tell people, don't you realize if you just thought about it this way, they don't want to hear that, right? What they really need is empathy, and they need healing. And so we can't impose that on others. We can model it, right? And that can be very helpful. But what I think is even more problematic is the mindset that's got a lot of momentum in our culture of people kind of encouraging others to have a victim mindset, and kind of spreading that victim mindset culture, and supposedly out of compassion. But I think it has a lot to do with people's own sense of self and wanting to be in the rescue or on the. We do a lot of, in the radical responsibility model, we do a lot of teaching around Cartman's drama triangle, which has that triangulation of the victim mindset, the persecutor mindset, and the rescuer mindset. And I think, there's a lot of people on that rescuer pole encouraging other people to have a victim mindset, and it becomes another vehicle for power. But it's very kind of shadowy power, and I don't think it really moves people's lives forward. And it's very understandable. Yes, there's a lot of injustice in our world, and people are victimized, but encouraging them to solidify a victim mindset and have that be their place of power, I don't think is ultimately helpful.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that, because I feel like there's so much in social media that unfortunately fans those flames, right? And and back to your point of like then you've got the kind of the rescuing and poor you, and then you have maybe an egoic role to play, and and the truth is that doesn't help anybody. So the answer is if you actually care about somebody and they're defensive and insisting on blame, it sounds like you're saying, Fleet, best thing you can do is model radical responsibility, be empathetic, and not try to point out their victim story to them. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if we feel the impulse, like we have to change this person, what's that all about?
Oh, seriously? It's like check your own ego, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's all very humbling. Fleet Maull, you are such a gift. It's been really a pleasure. I've learned so much today, and I'm so grateful to have had you on Getting Open. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Oh, I hope you loved that episode as much as I did. And I knew a lot about Fleet prior to this. There was so much that I didn't know, and I was so glad to be able to ask him. Just to summarize what I'm taking away, and I hope what you're taking away, you're listening and watching, that burning, transformative question: what can I do? What can I do? The eggs just broke. My heart just broke. Something bad just happened to me or somebody else. What can I do? As like Fleet said, radical self-empowerment, so simple, such a powerful practice. I'm certainly taking it to heart. I hope you do too. And as you know, I am such a passionate practitioner of somatic work, breath work, mindfulness, and so forth. I too am going to go to heartmath.co and take advantage of the free guided meditations. I'm going to go deeper in my practice. Honestly, if you're one of the people that insists that you can't meditate, I entreat you. Try going to heartmind.co. And by the way, not just once or twice. Try a practice every day for a month and see if you too can transform your life. And like Fleet beautifully said, if that can bring you home, because it sure has for me. Okay, that's our show. Thanks so much for tuning in. As always, email me at gettingopen@yourtango.com. I love hearing from you guys. Also, your comments on YouTube, Spotify, iHeart are so welcome. And if you're not subscribing wherever you get your podcast, please do. Dane, Jacqueline, Lily, we are bringing this show to you with our full hearts, and we just want to make sure you don't miss an episode. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.